Every single human on the planet needs to know what's in this interview. The information in here will serve you for the rest of your life, I promise you. Is our brain shrinking?
Yes. Yeah. Is our brain shrinking? Of course it's shrinking. The evolution of the brain began when we separated from the chimpanzees and the other great apes about 5-7 million years ago. And by about, Mrs. Ples, she was, hold on a second. Here is Mrs. Ples, you see.
Wow.
Mrs. Ples, that's the size of it. There you are. That's the size of the cranial capacity. Was about 400, 500 cc's. This is about 2 to 3 million years ago and found in South Africa. I think it was Sterkfontein was found. This is, of course, a plastic cast of it, but it just goes to show that that's sort of where we started from. And by 200,000 years ago, it had reached about 1,400 cc's cranial capacity. These were a family of people that were found in Herto, in Ethiopia. They were living beside the sea at the time. Herto now is beside a salt lake because the land has changed and a bit of sea was trapped, and so it's now evaporating and creating a salt lake. And they sell the salt, of course. Well, that was 1,400 cc's, 160,000 to 200,000 years ago. They're very similar to the people at Pinnacle Point in South Africa, because in the Pinnacle Point in South Africa, they have Curtis Marion and his friends have discovered caves in which people had lived about 160,000 years ago, and clear evidence that these were from culture and all that kind of paintings and all that stuff, that these were humans, and the incontrovertible evidence of exploitation of the marine food web. They killed and ate animals as well, but it was incontrovertible evidence. They would have eaten seaweeds, they would have eaten cockles and mussels and oysters and fish and of all sorts. And there's even evidence of them having been eating whales because whale teeth were found in the caves. They didn't go out and catch them. They were probably beach sea. But at any rate, incontrovertible evidence that early Homo sapiens was extensively using the marine food web. And John Parkington in Cape Town, he discovered much the same thing around the same time. So they migrated up around the coastlines to East Africa and places like that. And they gradually evolved bigger brains from what Mrs. Place was. And because she was about 2 million, 3 million years ago. And by 160,000 years ago, 100 to 200,000 years ago in Herto, we have this evidence of a cranial capacity reaching 1,400 cc's. And then we have Cro-Magnon. Cro-Magnon had a cranial capacity ranging from 1,500 to 1,700 cc's. Interestingly, 1,700 cc's is the size of a dolphin's brain, a contemporary dolphin's brain. But there you are. That's another story. But that was Cro-Magnon, and they walked into Europe with wearing necklaces of seashells and things like that. So that was the peak, 1,700 cc's. The present brain cranial capacity on average is 1,336 cc's. So we've lost the size of a cricket ball, if not bigger. And I have a the co-author, Lee Broadhurst, who's into all sorts of evolutionary stories and geophysics and things like that. She works at the FDA in the United States, and she considers that the most likely point of decline was the beginning of agriculture, when we turned more and more to land-based foods rather than the balance between the sea and the land. You have to remember that the brain evolved in the sea in the first place. So what was it using? The only thing it could be using would be marine foods, because there was little land available at the time, and this was all happening in the sea anyway. So the point really being that the brain owes its legacy to its origin, to marine foods, and we've forgotten about that. And that is a simple reason why the brain is shrinking and why mental ill health is escalating and IQ is falling. And if that goes on, we're facing the extinction of humanity. It's logical.
So then, could one say that because the Japanese, for example, have kept up with their high DHA consumption, they're very well known to eat a lot of seafood in general. And in my opinion, they're also very intelligent, and their work in many, many fields we see in society is fantastic. And so, can one say that they're actually, well, I don't know if we've done the measurements, but is it likely that their brains are a bit bigger, perhaps?
Yeah, they might be. I was invited by the Japanese government actually in 1990 to lecture in Japan, because they were concerned at the time. They told me they were concerned about McDonaldization of their food, because there was a lot of inroads of this sort of fast food stuff starting, and they wanted to get me to explain to the Japanese people at large just how important the Japanese traditional food style was. So yes, I have to agree with you, obviously, about that. And interestingly, that the minister at the end of the meeting, and after about a couple of weeks of lecturing all around Japan, the minister asked me to a meeting, and there was a huge long table with Dr. this and Dr. that and Dr. who and so on, all around this table. And he asked me to explain just what I've been doing for the last 2 weeks. And he then said, "Thank you, Professor Crawford, for explaining to us why we should agriculturalize the oceans." Those were his words. And they've actually started doing that.
To their great advantage, because I know they love seafood, and so now they have more of it. But
yes, what's quite interesting is that in 1990 there was not a shred of Japanese food shops in London, but now you can hardly go down a major street without seeing a sushi shop, which is really wonderful.
people are scared of raw meat, and they generally don't go, let's say, out of their way to get raw seafood. But then you look at sushi, and it
Yeah,
seems as though every single teenage girl, and also other people as well, are
yeah,
very, very fond of it. And so
yes,
you could almost say that it comes back to, us evolving in the ocean, or the brain evolving in the ocean, and that
yeah,
this is sort of a instinct, you could say.
yeah. I think so. I mean, during World War II, of course, fish and seafood were never rationed. Meat, milk, butter, and sugar, and all that stuff was rationed. But fish and seafood was never rationed, and a lot of people attribute our success of the soldiers and the fighting force to the fact that we had a great fleet of fishing boats that helped feed us during the war, when the Germans were doing their best to stop any kind of imports of food by sinking ships coming from America and things like that. And not only that, but during the war, every woman who was pregnant or with a child, feeding a child, was given was 95% or more women breastfed during the war, of course. And even before that, it was much like that. But every woman, either pregnant or feeding a child, was given cod liver oil, orange juice, and milk free of charge, delivered to her door by the milkman. So there you are. That was the message during the war. And we just forgot about that. From 1950, it was downhill all the way.
Yeah, I think we haven't forgotten about it. I think someone has deliberately erased the idea of those foods being healthy, especially the animal foods you mentioned.
I wouldn't be. I find it difficult to explain what's going on because in in 1972, when we first did the work on docosahexaenoic acid and company, we first did the work on the brain, and then we realized just how important docosahexaenoic acid was for the brain. And 36 species of different mammals. Brain capacity varied from species to species, but the chemistry never did. Chemistry was always the same. So that told us that the chemicals, DHA and arachidonic acid, and a whole lot of other stuff, trace elements as well, were critically important for the brain and its development and growth. And so we wrote a book called What We Eat Today and drew attention to this fact that that the brain required very specialized nutrients, much of which came from the sea. It also required stuff from the land. Don't knock the land. There was stuff important to the land as well. But the balance between what we got by living around the coastlines and estuaries and things like that, the balance from fish and seafood and the land was probably a bit in favor of the marine food web. And the reason I'm saying that is because the men could go off and hunt, and the chances of them being successful was probably a bit dodgy at times. But the women, even heavily pregnant, could walk the coast and pick up seaweeds, nosh on seaweeds, and pick up. They would have learned from watching the seabirds how to open oysters and things like that. And as the tide went out, there was just a wealth of all sorts of different types of seafood available, free of charge, just to pick up. And she could wander around the coastline and probably get some fish as well from some of the rocky pools. And to begin with, of course, it would all be raw. They'd be like the Japanese eating raw fish and seafood. So, so the women wouldn't have any problem wandering around the coast. If the men brought something back, fine, that's great. Let's have a bit of this and that. And so the balance between what they got from the land and what they got from the sea was, in my view, critically important to encephalization, the growth of the brain from Mrs. Place up to what we have today. And the tragedy is that nobody's been paying attention. In 1972, we wrote this book and said that if we don't pay attention to the nature of the brain, then brain disorders are going to follow in the wake of heart disease and cancer. And this is what has happened. At that time, Graham Rose wrote a review of our book, which was called What We Eat Today. It was written by my wife and myself. And in the review, he wrote that unless we paid attention to the requirements of the brain, then we're going to become, I quote, a race of morons. This is 1972. The science was already there. It's not just us. There was Gene Anderson in America working on DHA in the eye and all that kind of thing. There were other people working on it as well. But the evidence in 1972 was sufficient for that prediction to be made, that unless we did something about the brain, we'd become a race of morons. And this is what is happening.
What health effects do we see from higher DHA consumption, and what is it that we see when people don't get enough DHA? I guess beside the brain becoming smaller.
Well, there's a ton of evidence that cognition, learning, recognition, motor function are all depressed if you don't get enough. It's not just DHA. I have to say that seafood is rich in iodine, selenium, zinc, copper, and manganese. And the iodine deficiency is well known to be a cause of mental retardation. And there's something like 5 billion people at the moment, according to WHO, at risk to iodine deficiency. And that almost certainly carries the deficiency of the other trace elements as well, because the copper, zinc, manganese, and selenium are responsible for the enzymes in the brain that protect these highly peroxidizable molecules like arachidonic and docosahexaenoic acid that protect them from peroxidation. And if you don't protect them from peroxidation, then you get degeneration of the cell death. And Nicholas Bazan in New Orleans considers that it's likely to be a cause of Alzheimer's.
So naturally, of course, seafood is high in all of these, especially selenium, iodine, and then of course DHA. But the comment I get the most, and of course I already understand that this isn't a concern, but the comment I get the most is that, well, seafood is high in heavy metals and microplastics, and so I avoid it. Are you sure it's safe? I have a private community on school, and because I know how well people progress in there, I'd like to invite you to join. I think it could really, really help you out. It's the first link in the description.
The supply of both DHA and the trace elements, in my mind at any rate, and the evidence is pretty overwhelming, overrules any negative effects of microplastics or allegedly mercury toxicity. There's mercury in fish, there's mercury in everything. But there was a study done around Bristol, England, and the study involved over 14,000 pregnancies. And they studied Gene Golding and Joe Hibbelin from the National Institutes of Health in America, Gene Golding from Bristol University, and a bunch of other people as well. And the study was of what the mothers ate during the pregnancy. And then they followed the children up for 8 years of age. And the data they published in the Lancet in 2007 shows a straight line function, incremental function of the benefits of fish and seafood. The more you ate, the better the scores for behavioral, motor, verbal IQ of the children at 8 years of age, the more the mother ate during the pregnancy. And there is, for example, the Food and Drug Administration of America has said we should eat no more than 2 servings of fish a week, something like that, because of the risk of toxicity from methyl mercury. Well, there's not a scrap of evidence of that. I mean, you talked about the Japanese have been more intelligent. Well, the Japanese ladies have eaten this sort of stuff perhaps almost every day of the week, not just 2 servings a week, but practically every day of the week. And they've grown up, as you said, to have the children who've grown up to have the best longevity, the least major depression, and the best IQ, and the least of all those nasty things that happen in the brain. So where is the evidence? There's not a scrap of it. Not a scrap. And in fact, in the paper, in the Lancet, 2007 paper in the Lancet, they separated those who ate more than the FDA recommendation and those who ate less than the FDA recommendation, which was meant that they ate perhaps 1 or no fish during the pregnancy. And the ones who ate less than who complied with the FDA recommendation or ate less had the highest proportion of mental disorders. So there you are. That's pretty convincing. This was 14,000 pregnancies. Straight line function with the more efficient seafood the mother ate during pregnancy. Verbal IQ, motor and behavioral scores of the children at 8 years of age. That's pretty convincing. And in the paper, they wrote that this FDA advisory would do harm. And it probably is.
And because the evidence is so convincing and followed your work, again, you did a fantastic interview with Dr. Sarah Pugh. I've been eating, well, mostly mackerel, around 800 grams per day. And I can say it's been a very successful experiment. And so the total amount of EPA and DHA is 9.6 grams per day, which might be too much, but we'll see. We'll
That's a
see what
lot. Yeah, that's a lot.
it is. It certainly is. I wanted to ask, what does DHA do in the body?
That is an interesting question because, of course, there's been a lot of ideas about what it is doing. We're currently writing a trilogy, 3 papers on its function in vision, its electrochemical properties as a semiconductor, and hence, in the 3rd paper, its function in learning and cognition. So what is it doing? Now, the classical view about what it's doing is liquidity. It provides liquidity to the membrane. And liquidity is very important because during cell division, when the cell separates, they go into high shape change, very rapid shape change. And you have to have liquidity for that, otherwise the cell breaks, and that stirs up the immune system and causes all sorts of trouble. So liquidity is important, but it's not the only thing, because there's arachidonic acid in the brain as well as docosahexaenoic acid. And arachidonic acid has a lower melting point than DHA. So it's not just liquidity, although important as it is. And what we think is that it has 6 double bonds, all in the same shape in the cis configuration, and they're interrupted by methyl groups. So electrons can't jump from one double bond to another. If you have conjugated double bonds, that says double bond, double bond, double bond, the electron clouds around the double bonds overlap. So electrons can flow up and down. But if you've got a methyl group in the middle, that acts as a barrier. Now, this is beautiful. This is absolutely beautiful because DHA is a resistor. It resists flow of electrons. But if you pull one electron out by having a high hyperpolarization across the membrane, which you have during excitation, if you pull an electron out, another electron can jump into the hole that's left behind. And now there's a very beautiful thing here. Stop me if I'm getting too technical, but the electrons in the outer shell, there's 2 of them. One was spin positive, the other one was spin negative. And when we pull an electron out, the only electron that can occupy the hole that's left will have to have the opposite spin to the one that's existing. And in fact, it has to have all the quantum numbers of the one that's missing. Now, the beautiful thing about this is very simple and extremely elegant. This means that DHA, once an electron is pulled out, as in semiconduction, that's what happens in semiconduction. Once the electron is pulled out, the only flow of electrons that happens has to have the same quantum numbers of the one that was pulled out. That is the only explanation, as far as we can see, for the precision of the electrical signals that enable us to transmit information across the brain with absolute precision and absolute purity. Take, for example, vision. We see in color. Now, color means that the eye is being excited by photons of different wavelengths. The red aims at long wavelengths and the blue are shorter wavelengths. So a blue photon will have a very specific wavelength. That means it has a very specific energy, because energy and wavelengths are equivalent. So in effect, this explains how we can see in color, because you have the purity of electrons transmitting the energy of the excitation at the beginning to the brain. So it's not just it's transmitting the energy of the electron to the brain, which means it's transmitting the color to the brain. And that's how we see in color. It's absolutely beautiful. It is supremely beautiful. This a wonderful molecule, wonderful molecule.
What's its history? Where does it come from? And how long has it existed?
Oh, well, it couldn't have been present in significant amounts in the early period of life on the planet, the anaerobic phase of the prokaryotes. Anaerobic metabolism requires a lot of energy, and but doesn't produce energy itself of a very high level. The difference between anaerobic and aerobic metabolism, the aerobic metabolism is able to produce 8 times the amount of energy that anaerobic does. So for the first how many? 2-3 billion years of anaerobic life, you don't see in the fossil record any intracellular detail. There's no intracellular detail. Intracellular detail comes into the fossil record when oxygen using life begins. And what is intracellular detail but membranes? These are the lipid membranes. So the higher energy of air-breathing life was able to make lipids, which cost much more energy than was really available in anaerobic life, and make these lipids. And amongst that would have been DHA. They would have been able to make DHA. And in fact, you find high concentrations of DHA in single-cell systems in the seed, like dinoflagellates, for example. And we think that it's almost certain that DHA was the original chromophore that converted photons into electricity right at the beginning, because it absorbs in the ultraviolet. And at the beginning of air-breathing life, there would be no ozone layer. So the planet would have been pummeled by powerful ultraviolet light, and DHA absorbs slap in the middle of the UV range. And we think that it's very likely that it was absorbing the energy, the UV energy, which would excite the electrons and kick off electron flow.
So DHA comes in the SN1, SN2, and SN3 forms. And obviously only one of them is important. And of course, you've got the vegans and vegetarians who say, oh, you can get it from non-marine sources, which, I mean, I guess you can, but it's not going to be the SN2 DHA. And
No,
again,
yeah, I mean, there's no question about it that vegetarianism was not what evolved the big brain that we have today. And we're trying to maintain what we had as a result of the evolution that I described earlier. And unfortunately, that the move away from the marine food web is almost certainly, in our view, responsible for the decline in mental health. And decline in mental health and the shrinking IQ as well as the shrinking brain. It's it's unfortunate that this is happening. I mean, the warnings have been there for a long time, and between 2005 and 2013, there were 5 audits of the cost of public health. It started with the EU in 2005, and brain disorders came top at 386 billion euros. It was the topmost cause of all health costs. So people said, yeah, boo, this is all load of rubbish. Just new, clever psychiatric diagnostics. So they did numbers again. Excuse me. In 2010, and it was 789 billion euros. In the meantime, Paul Nicholson was in charge of a charity called Z2K, which was helping disadvantaged people. And Lord Alf Morris, who was champion of disabilities, asked our government in 2007, what is the cost of mental ill health? Well, our government didn't know the cost of mental ill health, but Lord Warner knew how the cost of drugs in the hospitals was escalating like this. So give them credit. They did the numbers. And Joe Nurse, who did the numbers for the Department of Health, came out with a number of 77 billion. Brain disorders, the top of the list. And she said the cost of brain disorders was greater than heart disease and cancer combined. So again, there was this yaboo response of the naysayers. So all new diagnostics, So using the same principles in 2010, 3 years later, the cost had risen to 105 billion. So nobody did anything. I mean, can you believe it? Brain disorders, unexpectedly, there was another audit done by the Wellcome Trust, exactly the same. I can't believe that there was no response from government anywhere to this evidence that brain disorders were leading the show. And as a consequence, it just got worse.
Oh yeah, certainly, especially see that with young people today. But I think my question is, why is SN2 DHA more important, and where do we get it?
Well, no, okay. The phospholipids are what make up the membranes. The phospholipids have a phosphate and nitrogen, choline, and then they're attached to a 3-carbon sugar thing, and then you have dangling from that 2 fatty acids. The first, this thing has called the glyceride thing has three hooks to it. One contains either phosphate or choline, or a positive or negatively charged molecule. The one in the middle contains polyunsaturated ones. The one at the end contains saturated or monounsaturated. So that's the way the membrane is built. And the SN2 is the middle one, and the SN1 is the saturated one. So that it's common throughout. There are several different types of phospholipids, different head groups, but the SN1 and SN2 position are always occupied either by a polyunsaturated in the SN2 or a saturated or monounsaturated in the SN1. That's the way it works. But so you get phospholipids with when you eat fish. When you eat the meat of fish, and oysters and mussels and all sorts of things.
So basically, the only way to get the correct form of DHA is to eat seafood, correct?
Well, no, not. well, you get it from supplements, but they probably come from the sea as well. Yeah, I guess that's right. There's very little, certainly none, in intensively reared land-based systems. In the early days, in the very early days, they would have been able to get it from things like small animals, shrews and hyraxes and things like that. These small animals can make DHA because it has the alpha-linolenic acid is the precursor. It has 18 carbons and 3 double bonds, and it grows, so to speak, to DHA, which is 22 carbons and 6 double bonds. And it's a long journey to get from 18 carbons with 3 double bonds to 22 carbons with 6 double bonds. And on the way, there are rate limiting reactions. And we showed way back in the 1970s that if you compared the rate of synthesis for brain growth compared to the preformed in rats, pups, newly born rat pups when the brain is developing. If you compare the rate of synthesis with the preformed thing, there's an order of magnitude 10 times more efficient to incorporate the preformed DHA into the brain rather than making it. And this shows up in human placenta, which throws all the precursors for DHA, alpha-linolenic acid, icosapentaenoic acid, and so on, throws them all back to the mother for reprocessing. It's only interested in transferring DHA across to the developing fetus in the brain.
So basically, forget about the idea of it being able to be converted or plant forms of, well, omega-3 as we call them, but it's alpha-linolenic acid.
I wouldn't say forget about it. It probably has a role, particularly in extreme vegetarian societies. But the point is, it's nowhere as efficient.
Yeah, exactly.
Nowhere.
And so for humans, I would at least argue that it's not enough. Would you agree?
Yeah. I mean, small mammals can make it because they have very fast rates of metabolism. And a squirrel has about 2.2% of its body weight as brain. So a squirrel has actually a bigger brain size compared to its body than we do. But you get up to a rhinoceros and 0.01, the fast-growing animals, the faster they grow, the smaller the brain gets because they can't make enough in time for. It's all protein. Protein is accumulated to get. As a rhino accumulates 1 ton body weight in 4 years. 1 ton body weight in 4 years. All that protein comes from the simplest food, namely grass, but it can't get a DHA to make a decent-sized brain.
That's very interesting. So the bigger you are, the more important it would be perhaps to get enough DHA. So could that explain why people at higher latitudes, so the Icelander, Norwegian, Swedes, why they're so tall perhaps? Because
I
they
don't know.
okay.
No comment on that.
Okay.
I think people in Iceland eat a lot of fish.
I want to ask about landlocked versus coastal countries. So, based on this, based on your work, it seems as though humans have to live where there is seafood. And in landlocked countries that are far away from any body of water, well, they can't get enough seafood. So then, of course, we as humans, we like to occupy, any land we can get, really. And so that's why we filled the entire Earth. Well, almost all of it.
Yes, the point about that is that actually 60% of all major cities on the planet are beside water. Well, 60% are mostly coastal, and many of the others are beside rivers of cities. Take Khartoum, for example. It's beside the confluence of the White Nile and the Blue Nile. And you go to Khartoum, and the fish shops are full of fish gathered from the rivers. So these inland populations, generally speaking, Philip Tobias made a point about this. He was a professor at Watersland, a great paleoanthropologist. And he made a very simple comment. Wherever humans were evolving, they had to have water to drink. That's absolutely right. But the point is that today is very different to the evolutionary process. The population expansion has taken people to places that perhaps are not really suitable. Hence the 5 billion people at risk to iodine deficiency. And these are mostly vegetarians, I have to say. And it's unfortunate that it's so easy to answer this, because in most places you can transport seaweed and things like that. I was asked by the Indonesian government and the World Health Organization to do help them with regard to the fact that they had something like 1 million severely mentally retarded children from iodine deficiency disease. They had a lot of other problems, and they've solved protein calorie malnutrition and vitamin A deficiency, but they hadn't solved this. And we did a survey, and there was it was just unbelievable, the amount of iodine deficiency that we saw. But none in the fishing villages, none in the fishing villages. And so one of the problems they had was because of the high temperatures and the high humidity, it was difficult to transport fish and seafood without refrigeration, which they didn't really have. So what we suggested was that they develop seaweed, and they now have the most massive great kelp farming, with individual fishermen having plots on the seabed which they grow kelp. And they're not only solving the problem of iodine and other trace element deficiencies, and seaweed also contains DHA as well, and that can be easily transported. But not only that, the people who are managing the seabed to grow kelp are making more money than the inland farmers. So there you have a double whammy. And add to this the kelp, we can't grow any more rainforests, but we can grow them in the sea with kelp forests. So they're not only providing food, fertilizer for the impoverished land, they're also fixing CO2 the same way that the Amazon forest does. So it's a double whammy and a triple whammy, if you like. And we really should be attending to what the Minister of Fisheries in Japan said, agriculturalizing the oceans. When you stop and think about it, 10,000 years ago, they were running out of this hunting and gathering stuff. So somebody said, well, why don't we develop agriculture? Well, they're clever enough 10,000 years ago to start developing agriculture on land because of the impoverishment of hunting and gathering. What we're doing in the sea is hunting and gathering. So surely we're clever enough now to start thinking about developing the marine food web and the coastal resources, cleaning up the estuaries, cleaning up the rivers, and cleaning up our coastlines, developing oysters, mussels, cockles, alive, whole, and all that kind of stuff. Planting seaweed, seabeds, seagrass, as the Japanese are doing, which just planting seaweeds and seagrass enhances the productivity of the fish. Just doing that.
So would you say that, again, in landlocked countries, seaweed would be enough of a solution for those people, at least, to not need seafood?
Certainly, yes.
Wow.
But then, as I mentioned, most of the landlocked countries have access to water, but you can't live without water. So where do you get water? You get water from the rivers, and the rivers contain fish. And the problem with that is that we've now polluted the rivers, and the rivers are not containing the wealth of fish that they used to contain. I mean, in my youth, up in Fort Augustus in Venetia, where I went to school, the little rivers there were just stuffed full of trout. You could pick them up with your hand. They call it guzzling for trout, which is you put your hand, they like to stay under stones and things like that. You tickle their stomach and then grab them. Interestingly enough, the monks taught us how to fish.
Oh yeah.
Taught how to fish.
I was in a town in Georgia, and yeah, there was a river there, and it was filled with trash. So, of course, in the market they were selling fish, and I thought, yeah, maybe not the best idea to eat that fish. But again, I was gonna return to Sweden anyway, and in Sweden, there's a bunch of great mackerel and seafood in general. Okay, well, that's interesting. That fixes the landlocked versus coastal problem. What would you say is the most important micronutrients for brain health? So we've got DHA, selenium, copper, manganese.
Well, the B vitamins are very important as well. And funnily enough, seaweed, oysters, mussels, and all that stuff are very rich in a range of B vitamins. They're important. Vitamin D is important. Vitamin A is important, uh, particularly for the eye, as is well known. But the whole shooting match is important for the brain. Its metabolism depends on the B vitamins very intensively, and it is the most energy utilizing organ in the body. It's only 2% of the body size, and it's less than that now, but still, never mind. The uh, the body size is sorry, the brain size is very much dependent on its growth before birth, when the mother needs to be nourished well with all these micronutrients as well as DHA.
Since DHA is very easily peroxidized, would you say that fish oil, again, of course, it's probably, if someone isn't eating a lot of seafood, yeah, fish oil could perhaps be a solution. But would you say that seafood is almost necessary because with fish oil, since it's very easily peroxidized and they don't control for the temperature and you don't know how it has been handled and it's probably been exposed to light, that it would be perhaps risky or not as beneficial to do fish oil supplements?
Yeah, that is the problem with fish oil, that it doesn't, of course, being an oil, contain the water soluble nutrients as well. And so if you want to rely on supplements, you really need to take a supplement that contains the B vitamins and trace elements as well. You see that we've referred to this before, but copper, manganese, zinc, selenium, these these trace elements are responsible for the enzymes. And get this, nature is actually very clever, because it has different antioxidant enzymes based on the different elements in the cell membrane, in the cytosol, and in the mitochondria. Each one has its own specific metal enzyme to protect it against peroxidation. So these trace elements are really terribly important, as well as the DHA and the B vitamins.
And so
You
when
need the
you
whole package, in a sense.
so when you keep again the DHA, let's say in a semi-living system, like a raw fish, for example, it obviously comes with the copper and the selenium and the manganese, etc. But if you extract the oil, of course, you remove it from its, well, the environment it's supposed to be in, and so peroxidation occurs way more quickly. I guess that
Yeah,
would be an explanation.
peroxidation is bad news. But you protect against it if you take these trace elements, and the B vitamins are also important in that. So it's a whole package that is important. Let me give you an example. That the supplements are mostly oils. Now, there are two types of fat in the body. One is the stuff around your waistline. That's what we call storage fat. The other is the stuff in the brain and every cell in the body, which is the constructional fat. We call it structural fat, which is a phospholipid. The phospholipids build the cell membrane. the triglycerides build your stomach fats and all as storage fats. Every tissue has a certain amount of storage fat because it stores energy. But the waistline's the one that worries us from time to time. So, having said that, you need to think about cod liver oil compared to cod meat. The meat will contain the structural fat, the oil, the storage fat. Now, what is the composition of the oil? Composition of the oil is about 12% eicosapentaenoic acid, or EPA, and about 8% DHA. So what is the composition? That's the triglyceride. So what is the composition of the meat that you eat? Well, it's mostly phospholipid, and it contains, wait for it, 47% DHA. Not 8%, 47%. And does it contain any of those other things? No, very little of anything else. The membrane structural component of cod muscle is predominantly DHA in the SN2 position, as we discussed before. So that gives you an idea of the difference between eating the meat as opposed to eating or drinking the oil.
It's time to eat cod then. You mentioned earlier that DHA absorbs in the UV range, and obviously we have a lot of DHA in our nervous system as well as the brain. And
Yeah,
the brain, at least, is very metabolically active, so it has many mitochondria that are very active. Now, you're probably familiar with biophotons.
with what?
Biophotons, the fact that
Oh yeah,
mitochondria emit light. And so the interesting thing would be, okay, so you have a bunch of mitochondria that are emitting a bunch of light in the UV range, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, there are people who say that all life emits ultra weak biophotons in the UV range. And then you've also got a lot of DHA. And
yeah,
so maybe that's one of the things that the DHA is doing that's really important, that it's absorbing this
yeah.
light and utilizing it for signaling and also energy recycling, perhaps.
Yeah, I never thought about that as a principal um, mechanism for the signaling systems, but it's quite plausible. I mean, the mitochondria are stuffed full of DHA, and mitochondria work by electron transport. So my main interest really has been on the electron side of it, and apart from photon absorption, which of course is the starting point, but the production of photons from the mitochondria is another story that I'm not really into.
Okay, because the way I've understood DHA, and I must confess, due to Dr. Jack Cruz, is that it turns light into an electric signal, and it can do the reverse as well. And so it's outstandingly important for optical signaling and also electrical signaling. So we use both. And since the brain again is well, I would say the computer of the body where signaling is the most important, and also in the nervous system as well, it would be very plausible that we'd have a lot of DHA in there so that signaling could occur with very good precision, with wonderful precision, as you explained earlier, because of the again the electron spin. So that's
And
that's something I've been thinking about.
semiconduction.
Certainly.
But the beauty about semiconduction is that by acting as a semiconductor, it can amplify the signal. And what you need in recognition, for example, you stop and think about it. You meet somebody in the street, you haven't met them for a long time, uh, and you recognize the name. You see the face and you recognize the name instantly. Now, how do you do that? And what you have to have is a whole pile of electrons coming down from the retinas, two retinas, don't forget, two retinas, and being decoded in the brain to be converted into something that the brain can identify with the memory of the name. And to do that, you're going to have a very complex system of electron clouds that form to make a memory. And it's the only way that's going to work. And the point really is that the brain is sending electrons all the time. If you put electrodes on the skull, there's electrons flowing. And if there's no electron movement, it's brain dead. So the question is, how did you recognize the name? And what I think you need is some kind of mechanism to amplify the signal when you get the cohesion of the incoming cloud with the one that's in memory. You've then got to send the signal. And what better than to be able to amplify the signal? Because what you want is a sudden avalanche of electrons to wake the brain up and say, hey, his name is Charlie. We know this is what happens because, I mean, if you take, during operations on the brain, they stimulate electron flows in different regions of the brain, and while people are awake, and things happen. All of it, you just need a flow of electrons, and boom, you get a memory. But you need this flow of electrons, and you need the flow of electrons to excite the recognition, and that requires amplification. So semiconduction properties of things like DHA, and there are probably others as well that do it, but semiconduction properties will amplify the signal to get recognition.
The marine life at higher latitudes is higher in DHA, while at the equator, since the water is warm, it has less DHA. Now, at higher latitudes, it's also cold. At lower latitudes, you have more sunlight. And so, I've also heard that with sunlight helps recycle DHA. Can you confirm if that's the case?
Say again?
That sunlight helps recycle DHA.
Does it? I suppose it does. Well, put it this way, that as you see things, you don't actually need sunlight to do it, but sunlight will do it stronger than anything else. As you see things, DHA, the photoreceptor, is turning over. And because the photons are coming in all the time, boom, 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 and the photoreceptor chemistry is turning over. And Nicholas Bazan in New Orleans has shown that during the turning over, DHA and rhodopsin co-migrate together to form the new disk in the photoreceptor. So that's happening all the time. That's happening all the time. You don't need sunlight. Any light will do it. Just the plain function of the photoreceptor, it has to turn over.
Okay, I see. Because the way I thought about it was that because you have more sunlight perhaps at the equator, and the marine life has less DHA, that would sort of balance things out, while at higher latitudes, you have more DHA in the marine life, but you also have, again, more of a requirement because there's less light in the environment.
Now I have to tell you, we have another hypothesis here which we have published. And that is, we started with the grey whale. Now, the grey whale goes up from its reproduction grounds all the way up to the Bering Sea, where it spends the summer noshing on all this stuff that's full of DHA. And then it comes down all the way, practically halfway across the planet to the breeding grounds in the just below the Gulf of Mexico. And a friend of ours, Javier from the university in Brazil, wanted to know, why were they doing this? And we came up with a hypothesis about this because it was clear that from the chemistry of samples of these animals in the Barents Sea and all the way down was changing. And when they got to the warm tropical regions, you're quite right, the seafood, the basic flora of the seafood and the beginning of it are much richer in arachidonic acid than are way up in the Barents Sea. And there's another story here because it's another complete story. Is the reproduction of mammals is dependent on omega-6 fatty acids. And we asked our question was, how is it that marine mammals who are noshing on omega-3 all the time were able to acquire arachidonic acid? Well, there was the answer. That's why they were doing this big long migration, to get the warm waters, but where stuff is richer in arachidonic acid than it is way up in the Barents Sea. And when we looked at the grey whale and the dolphin, just out of interest to stir it up a bit, when we looked at both the grey whale and the dolphin, we looked at the lipids in the liver and the muscle, a huge amount of muscle in a big grey whale. There are actually more arachidonic acid in its elongation product than DHA in the liver and muscle phospholipids. And that is because mammals require arachidonic acid for the reproductive process. So that explains these long migrations.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. And again, I think humans living at the equator, there's probably a reason more arachidonic acid is probably beneficial there, while having more DHA is probably beneficial at higher latitudes. I believe it's related to, well, perhaps the cold, because
Yeah,
of, well, I've heard that DHA helps with cell membrane signaling in the cold.
sure. Well, it almost certainly, I don't know about its actual signaling, but it certainly is important because if you stop and think about it, a cod has to accelerate from naught to, I don't know what it is, naught to 30 miles an hour or 60 miles an hour in about 0.3 of a second to catch its prey. I mean, just like that. And to achieve that, you need a high degree of liquidity. So what better than to stuff your muscle full of DHA, which it does. I told you earlier, the phospholipid's 47% DHA. So that high degree of liquidity enables the system to, boom, do these hugely high accelerations to catch their prey. And that's in cold water.
I know your primary work is with DHA, but I'm wondering what is the role of EPA?
Aha. Well, no. There is evidence that EPA works well with various things like attention deficit disorders and things like that, but EPA works better than DHA. And I think the reason for this is probably that it is a very good encourager for blood vessel and blood vessel flow of blood in the vessels. So I think that this is probably one of its important roles is to maintain good blood flow. And the brain requires good blood flow. And if you've got dodgy arteries in the brain, EPA will certainly help to get the blood flowing a bit better. So I think that could well be its role. It's not in, it really doesn't appear in brain lipids. You don't see much EPA at all. So it's not doing anything specifically in the brain, but it could well be assisting blood flow and immune system responses.
That is very interesting. Then in that case, it can help with blood pressure as well, I'd
Yeah,
think.
very probably, yes.
Okay. I see. And also in the cold, it becomes more important because again, the well, blood flow is impaired in the feet and the hands, especially. And so if you have more EPA, that might help. Then there are also the glucose and the cholesterol acting as antifreeze, but that's another story. I
Yeah.
guess I guess my last question and the question that will really solidify this for the viewer is, what is your age, sir?
How old am I?
Yes.
95. I was 95 last week.
And so and, and so now the viewer might realize that you're truly a testament to your work.
Well,
You
I don't know about that. I mean, I had a misspent youth about. Well, there you are.
Now I'd
But
say
anyway,
again,
I
95
told you to my mother.
95 with this amazing mental acuity, and of course you've been consuming DHA for a very long time because you've known of its importance.
Yeah, I think I didn't know anything about DHA until 1972, of course, and I don't think I paid much attention to that. But I do like fish and seafood, and funnily enough, in the early days when I spent quite a lot of time in teaching at Makerere Medical School in East Africa, Kampala, Uganda, and it was. I mean, the food there was hardly any of this processed stuff. We had a lovely supermarket there, but or allegedly called a supermarket. But the food there was nothing was processed. Very little processed food. And when I came back to the UK, in 1965, um, I suddenly realized the huge difference between what people ate in Africa and what we eat. And that's why we wrote this book, What We Eat Today, and why Graham Rose said if we don't pay attention to the brain, we're going to become a race of morons, which is what's happening, unfortunately. And it's about time governments woke up and did something in response to this. But so far as my personal life is concerned, I probably didn't pay much attention to anything until I got into my 80s or something like that. Then I began to worry about getting old, and now I'm 95, so that's my life.
So just to clarify, so you haven't focused on eating a lot of DHA.
Well, certainly, I mean, nowadays we would have fish perhaps 5 times a week, or fish or seafood. We love things like crabs and mussels and things like that. But we would have an evening meal with either fish or seafood.
Well, in that
Most.
case, it checks out the cognitive capacity. Um, well,
But like the grey whale, I always have the same message that, like the grey whale, you also need arachidonic acid. And so just occasionally we'll have a nice big important thing to have in the animal world would be if they fed the animals properly, which they don't any longer. But the important thing would be liver and kidneys. The offal is really quite important because um, it contains a whole bunch of micronutrients as well as the arachidonic acid, and it doesn't. Beef and things like that don't contain much DHA at all. They do contain icosapentaenoic acid, though, which is significant. Liver and onions is really nice.